Before we begin, if you're fascinated by the hidden moments in history that almost destroyed civilization, hit that subscribe button right now. What you're about to hear has been declassified for less than 2 decades, and most people still don't know how close we came to nuclear annihilation. October 27th, 1962. While the world watched the Cuban Missile Crisis unfold on their television screens, 3 Soviet submarine commanders, isolated beneath the Caribbean Sea, each held their finger over a button that could launch a nuclear torpedo. They had lost contact with Moscow. They were being hunted by American destroyers dropping depth charges. Their air was running out. The heat inside their submarines had reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit, and according to their orders, they had every reason to believe that World War III had already started. This is the story of the day humanity should have ended, but didn't. And the 3 men who decided our fate while suffocating in steel coffins under the ocean. Let me take you back to October 1962. The world was already on the brink. American spy planes had discovered Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, just 90 miles from Florida. President Kennedy had ordered a naval blockade, which the Soviets called an act of war. Both superpowers were moving their pieces into position like chess players who knew the next move could be. But here's what almost nobody knew at the time. The Soviets had already moved for Foxtrot-class submarines into position near Cuba. These weren't just any submarines. Each one carried a secret weapon that American intelligence had completely failed to detect. A nuclear torpedo. 1 torpedo with the power of the Hiroshima bomb, and the authorization to use it rested with just 3 men on each submarine: the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. No need to contact Moscow. No need for approval from the Kremlin. 3 men in a steel tube could end the world. The submarines were designated B-59, B-4, B-36, and B-130. They had left their base in the Kola Peninsula in early October, ordered to take up defensive positions around Cuba. The journey was supposed to be secret, but the Pentagon had been tracking Soviet naval movements for weeks. What the Americans didn't know was what these submarines were carrying. The Soviets had been incredibly careful about this. The nuclear torpedoes, officially designated as the T-5, had been loaded in absolute secrecy. Even most of the crew members didn't know what was in the special sealed compartment. The weapon had a yield of around 10 kilotons. To put that in perspective, that's about 2/3 the power of the bomb that destroyed Hiroshima. But unlike Hiroshima, this weapon would detonate underwater, creating a massive radioactive tsunami that would contaminate everything for miles. If fired near the American fleet, it wouldn't just sink ships, it would irradiate the entire naval group, killing thousands instantly and leaving the ocean toxic for decades. Now, here's where it gets absolutely terrifying. The authorization protocols for using nuclear weapons in the Soviet military normally required approval from Moscow, from the highest levels of government. But these submarines were going to be operating in a combat zone, potentially cut off from communication. So the Soviet Northern Fleet commander, Admiral Vasili Arkhipov, made a decision that would haunt historians for decades. He gave the submarine commanders pre-authorization to use the nuclear torpedoes if certain conditions were met. If they were under attack and couldn't surface to contact Moscow, and if they believed war had already broken out, they could fire. The decision required unanimous agreement from the captain, the political officer, and the executive officer. 3 votes. That was all that stood between peace and nuclear war. The 4 submarines began their journey south in early October. They traveled on the surface at first, moving through the Norwegian Sea and then down the Atlantic. The plan was to arrive near Cuba by late October and establish a defensive perimeter. But almost immediately, things started going wrong. The Foxtrot-class submarines were diesel-electric boats, meaning they ran on diesel engines on the surface and battery power when submerged. They needed to surface regularly to run their diesel engines and recharge their batteries. This made them vulnerable to detection, and the U.S. Navy was watching the Atlantic very carefully. Within days of leaving port, American patrol planes spotted the submarines. The game of cat and mouse had begun. By October 23rd, when Kennedy announced the naval quarantine of Cuba, all 4 submarines were being actively tracked by U.S. forces. The American military had mobilized the largest naval operation since World War II. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, submarines, patrol planes, they all converged on the Caribbean. Their orders were clear: enforce the blockade, track all Soviet vessels, and prevent any ships from reaching Cuba. But there was a massive problem. The Americans had no idea the submarines carried nuclear weapons. They thought they were dealing with conventional diesel submarines that could be harassed and forced to surface. They had no idea they were hunting boats that could vaporize their entire fleet with a single shot. The Soviet submarine commanders faced an impossible situation. They were ordered to reach Cuba and establish defensive positions, but they were being hunted by overwhelming American forces. Every time they surfaced to recharge batteries or get fresh air, they risked being spotted. So they stayed submerged for longer and longer periods. And this is where the real nightmare began. Foxtrot-class submarines were not designed for tropical waters. They had been built for the cold Arctic seas around the Soviet Union. The cooling systems couldn't handle the warm Caribbean waters. As the submarines dove deeper and stayed submerged longer, the internal temperature began to rise. The air conditioning systems failed. The temperature inside the submarines climbed to 100 degrees, then 110, then 120. Sailors were collapsing from heat exhaustion. The carbon dioxide levels were rising because the air recycling systems couldn't keep up. Men were taking turns lying near the few working air vents, gasping for oxygen. And they couldn't communicate with Moscow. Radio signals can't penetrate seawater, so submarines need to surface to send or receive messages. But every time they approached the surface, American ships were waiting. The Soviet commanders had lost all contact with their headquarters. They had no idea what was happening in the world above. Were the Americans and Soviets already at war? Had nuclear missiles been launched? Was Cuba being invaded? They were operating in complete information blackness, and their orders said that if they believed war had started, they were authorized to use their nuclear weapons. On October 27th, everything came to a head. This day would become known as Black Saturday, the most dangerous day of the Cold War. And it's the day when 3 separate submarine commanders on 3 separate vessels nearly fired their nuclear torpedoes. Let me tell you what happened on each submarine, because each story is unique, and each one came terrifyingly close to ending the world. Let's start with submarine B-59, commanded by Captain Valentin. B-59 had been submerged for nearly 24 hours, running on batteries and trying to evade American destroyers. The conditions inside were hellish. The temperature had reached 140 degrees Fahrenheit. Sailors were fainting. The air was so thick with carbon dioxide that breathing felt like drowning. Captain Savitsky was a tough, experienced officer, But even he was reaching his breaking point. They had been underwater for so long that the batteries were nearly dead. If they didn't surface soon, they would lose all power and sink to the bottom of the ocean. But surfacing meant exposing themselves to the American ships above. Then the depth charges started. Now the Americans weren't trying to sink the Soviet submarines. They were using practice depth charges, small explosive devices designed to signal the submarines to surface. The Pentagon's strategy was to harass the submarines until they gave up and surfaced for identification. But here's the problem. The men inside B-59 had no way of knowing these were practice charges. All they heard was the sound of explosions getting closer and closer. Boom. 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 Equipment shook. Men grabbed onto whatever they could in the heat and chaos and lack of oxygen. With no communication from Moscow, Captain Savitsky came to a conclusion. War had started. The Americans were trying to sink them. It was time to use the nuclear torpedo. Savitsky turned to his officers and reportedly shouted something that still chills historians to this day. Maybe the war has already started up there, while we are doing somersaults here. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy. He ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch. The weapons officer began the arming sequence. In the torpedo room, sailors who had been kept in the dark about what they were carrying suddenly realized they were about to fire a nuclear weapon. The political officer on board, Ivan Maslenikov, agreed with 2 votes in favor of launching. According to Soviet protocol, they needed 3. The third vote belonged to the executive officer, Vasili Arkhipov. Now, Vasili Arkhipov is a name you need to remember, because this man literally saved the world. Arkhipov was not just any executive officer. He had been the executive officer on the submarine K-19 the previous year. When that submarine suffered a catastrophic reactor accident, Arkhipov had helped save that crew and had been exposed to massive amounts of radiation in the process. He knew what nuclear weapons could do. He knew the consequences of nuclear warfare in a way that most officers didn't. And as the debate raged inside B-59, with Captain Savitsky insisting they fire and the crew preparing the weapon, Arkhipov refused to give his consent. The argument that followed was heated. Voices were raised. Savitsky was furious. They were under attack, he insisted. They had their orders. They had the authority. But Arkhipov stood firm. He argued that they had no confirmation that war had started. The depth charges might be warning shots. If they fired a nuclear torpedo, they would definitely start World War III. There would be no going back. They needed to surface, assess the situation, and try to establish contact with Moscow. Savitsky was livid, but without unanimous agreement, he couldn't launch. Arkhipov had vetoed the nuclear strike after what must have felt like an eternity to everyone on board. Savitsky agreed to surface. When B-59 broke the surface, the crew saw something that must have been both terrifying and surreal. They were surrounded by American warships. The aircraft carrier USS Randolph was nearby, along with 11 destroyers. Helicopters circled overhead. It was an overwhelming show of force, but there was no shooting. The Americans signaled for B-59 to identify itself and leave the area. after some tense communication, during which the Soviets refused to allow American sailors to board. B-59 was permitted to depart. The submarine limped away, its batteries recharged just enough to make it back toward Soviet waters. The crew had no idea how close they had come to starting a nuclear war, and the Americans had no idea they had just avoided being vaporized. But B-59 wasn't the only submarine that nearly fired that day. Let's talk about submarine B-4, commanded by Captain Arkhipov. B-4 was in a similar desperate situation. They had been submerged for extended periods, tracked by American forces, unable to establish communication with Moscow. The conditions on board were just as hellish. Heat exhaustion, carbon dioxide, poisoning, equipment failures. Captain Katov was facing the same impossible decision as Savitsky. The Americans were dropping depth charges on them too. The explosions were getting closer. The crew was panicking, and just like on B-59, the captain and political officer were leaning toward launching the nuclear torpedo. But B-4 had something that B-59 didn't. Better information, or at least slightly less terrifying circumstances. Through a combination of luck and brief radio intercepts, when they approached the surface, Captain Katov had managed to catch fragments of radio broadcasts. He wasn't certain, but it seemed like there hadn't been a full-scale nuclear exchange yet. The world might still be at peace, even if it felt like war down in the depths. This tiny bit of information, this sliver of doubt, was enough to make Katov hesitate. Like Arkhipov, on B-59, Katov decided that firing a nuclear weapon without absolute certainty that war had started would be a catastrophic mistake. He ordered the submarine to surface and attempt communication. When B-4 surfaced, they too found themselves surrounded by American ships. The U.S. Navy had been tracking them for hours. But again, the Americans were not opening fire. They were signaling, communicating, trying to force the Soviets to identify themselves and leave the area. Captain Kitov complied. B-4 identified itself, refused to be boarded, and was allowed to depart. Another nuclear crisis averted, though once again, neither side fully understood how close they had come to mutual destruction. Now let's talk about the third submarine, B-36, commanded by Captain Alexei Dubov. B-36's story is perhaps the most frightening because it shows how differently things could have gone with just slightly different circumstances. B-36 was operating farther from the main American fleet but was still being tracked and harassed. They too had lost communication with Moscow. They too were suffering in the brutal heat and failing air systems, and they too were being hit with depth charges. Captain Dubivko was a by-the-book officer, a man who followed orders to the letter, and his orders were clear. If under attack and unable to communicate with headquarters, and if he believed war had started, he was authorized to use the nuclear torpedo. The debate on B-36 was different than on the other submarines. The political officer was more cautious, asking questions about whether they could be absolutely certain that war had broken out. The executive officer was torn, seeing the logic in both positions, and Captain Dubivko himself, despite his by-the-book nature, found himself facing the weight of the decision. If he fired, millions would die. The Soviet Union would be destroyed in the retaliatory strikes. His crew, his family, everyone he knew would be incinerated. But if war had already started and he didn't fire, he would be failing in his duty, allowing American ships to operate with impunity while his country burned. In the end, like the other submarines, B-36 chose not to fire. The deciding factor was the same uncertainty that had saved B-59 and B-4. Without absolute confirmation, that war had started. Without being able to communicate with Moscow, launching a nuclear weapon felt like a step too far. B-36 surfaced, was confronted by American ships, and withdrew from the area. 3 submarines, 3 separate decisions. 3 times the world was saved from nuclear war, all on the same day. And the horrifying thing is, almost nobody knew it was happening. President Kennedy didn't know. He was in the White House Situation Room, dealing with the broader Cuban Missile Crisis. Unaware, the 3 Soviet submarine commanders were debating whether to launch nuclear torpedoes at American ships. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara didn't know. The Pentagon's strategy of using practice depth charges to force the submarines to surface seemed reasonable when they thought they were dealing with conventional submarines. They had no idea they were essentially playing Russian roulette with nuclear weapons, and the American sailors on those destroyers dropping depth charges. They had no idea that one wrong move, one depth charge that landed too close and convinced the Soviet commander that they were under genuine attack, could have resulted in a nuclear detonation that would have killed them all and started World War III. On the Soviet side, Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in Moscow, also unaware of how close his submarine commanders had come to launching nuclear weapons. The Soviet High Command had lost contact with the submarines and had no idea what was happening in the Caribbean. They were flying blind, just like the submarine commanders themselves. The 4th submarine, B-130, managed to avoid the worst of the confrontations and never reached the point where its commander was seriously considering using the nuclear torpedo. But it too was being tracked and harassed by American forces. October 27th would end with no nuclear weapons fired, but it wouldn't end the crisis. That summer day, a Soviet surface-to-air missile shot down an American U, the spy plane, over Cuba, killing the pilot, Major Rudolph Anderson. This was the only direct combat casualty of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and it nearly caused Kennedy to authorize military strikes on Cuba. The situation was spiraling out of control, but Kennedy and Khrushchev, both terrified by how close they were coming to nuclear war, began serious negotiations to end the crisis. Over the next few days, they reached an agreement. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba. The Americans would publicly promise not to invade Cuba and would secretly agree to remove American missiles from Turkey. The crisis would end, and the world would step back from the brink. But for decades, almost nobody knew about the submarines. The story of B-59, B-4, and B-36 remained classified. The Soviet Union never publicly acknowledged that their submarines had carried nuclear torpedoes, or that their commanders had come close to using them. The Americans never publicly revealed how close their depth-charging campaign had come to triggering a nuclear response. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of the Soviet Union, that historians began to piece together what had really happened. Interviews with surviving crew members, declassified documents, and scholarly conferences revealed the terrifying truth. We had been far closer to nuclear war than anyone realized. Vasili Arkhipov, the man who had refused to authorize the nuclear launch on B-59, became known as the man who saved the world. He never sought fame for his actions. He continued his naval career, eventually becoming a vice admiral, and he rarely spoke about the events of October 19. He died in 1998, just as the full story of his actions was beginning to be understood by the world. At his funeral, his wife said that he carried the weight of that decision for the rest of his life, always wondering if he had made the right choice, always aware of how close they had come to catastrophe. The other commanders, Savitsky, Kitov, and Dubivko, also lived with the knowledge of what they had almost done. In later interviews, they described the impossible pressure of that moment, the heat, the explosions, the isolation, the certainty that they were about to die, and the question of whether they should take the enemy with them. Captain Kitov, in an interview decades later, said that he still had nightmares about that day. He dreamed of pressing the launch button and watching the flash of the nuclear explosion, and then he would wake up in a cold sweat, grateful that it had only been a dream. The question that haunts historians is this: what if the circumstances had been just slightly different? What if one of the submarines had been hit by a depth charge that caused real damage, convincing the commander beyond doubt that the Americans were trying to sink them? What if one of the submarines had suffered a complete communication failure earlier, leaving them with no information at all and forcing them to assume the worst? What if one of the political officers had been more aggressive, tipping the vote toward launching? What if Vasili Arkhipov had not been on B-59, and the decision had fallen to someone else who might have agreed with Captain Savitsky? The answer is terrifying. If any one of those submarines had fired its nuclear torpedo, the American fleet would have been devastated. Thousands of sailors would have died instantly. The radioactive contamination would have spread for miles, and President Kennedy would have been faced with an impossible choice. The United States had just been hit with a nuclear weapon. American servicemen were dead. The public would demand retaliation. The military would insist on immediate strikes against Soviet targets, and once that retaliation began, the Soviets would have no choice but to respond with their own nuclear weapons. The escalation would be unstoppable. Military analysts have run simulations of what would have happened if the Cuban Missile Crisis had gone hot. The estimates are apocalyptic. In the first few hours, major cities on both sides would be destroyed. New York, Washington, Moscow, Leningrad. Tens of millions dead. In the following days, as both sides exhausted their nuclear arsenals, the death toll would climb into the hundreds of millions, and then would come the nuclear winter. The smoke and ash from burning cities would rise into the atmosphere, blocking out the sun. Global temperatures would plummet. Agriculture would collapse. Famine would kill billions more. Human civilization as we know it would end. And it all could have started because 3 men in a submarine, suffering from heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning, isolated from communication and terrified for their lives, made a decision in a moment of panic. That's how fragile our world is. That's how close we came to extinction. One vote, one man's refusal to go along with the launch order. That's what saved us. The story of these 3 submarines teaches us something profound about nuclear weapons and about human nature. Nuclear weapons are often discussed in abstract terms. Deterrence, mutually assured destruction, strategic balance. We talk about them as if they're chess pieces, tools of policy, mathematical equations. But the reality is that nuclear weapons are controlled by human beings. Human beings who get scared, who make mistakes, who operate with incomplete information, who crack under pressure. And in moments of crisis, when decisions need to be made in minutes or seconds, Those human beings hold the fate of the world in their hands. The Cuban Missile Crisis is remembered as a success story of diplomacy, a moment when Kennedy and Khrushchev pulled back from the brink through skillful negotiation. And that's true. But what we often forget is that while the leaders were negotiating, while the diplomats were working, there were dozens of other moments where things could have gone catastrophically wrong. The submarine commanders were just 3 of those moments. There was also the American pilot who nearly dropped a nuclear bomb by accident when his plane had mechanical trouble. There was the Soviet radar station that detected what they thought was an incoming American missile strike, which turned out to be a computer error. There was the American base in Okinawa that almost launched nuclear-armed fighters because of a miscommunication. Every single one of these incidents could have started World War III. We survived the Cuban Missile Crisis, not just because of good leadership at the top, but because of dozens of individual decisions by people whose names we'll never know, people who chose caution over aggression, who demanded confirmation before acting, who refused to fire first, even when they were terrified and under pressure. We got lucky, and the terrifying thing is that we're still relying on that same luck today. There are still thousands of nuclear weapons in the world, many of them on air. Trigger alert, ready to launch in minutes. There are still submarines prowling the oceans with nuclear weapons on board. There are still early warning systems that could malfunction. There are still human beings in command positions who could make a mistake. The world has changed since 1962, but the fundamental danger hasn't gone away, and the story of B-59, B-4, and B-36 reminds us that we're always just one bad decision away from catastrophe. So what can we learn from this? First, we learn the importance of communication. The submarine commanders were operating in information blackness. They couldn't talk to Moscow. They couldn't verify whether war had started. They were making life and death decisions based on assumptions and guesswork. Modern military communication is better, but it can still fail. Ensuring that leaders have accurate, real-time information in a crisis is crucial. Second, we learn the importance of having multiple decision-makers. The Soviet protocol requiring 3 votes to launch a nuclear weapon saved the world. If the decision had rested with just one person, just Captain Savitsky alone, we might not be here today. Having checks and balances, requiring multiple people to agree before taking catastrophic action, builds in a crucial safety margin. Third, we learn that experience with the consequences of nuclear weapons matters. Vasili Arkhipov had survived a reactor accident. He had been exposed to radiation. He understood in a visceral way what nuclear weapons meant. That experience informed his decision to veto the launch. Today, as the generation that lived through World War II and the early Cold War passes away, we risk losing that institutional memory of what nuclear weapons can do. We need to ensure that the people who control these weapons understand their awesome power and their terrible consequences. And finally, we learn that we cannot rely on luck forever. We survived October 27th, 1962, because a handful of people made the right choice in the most pressured circumstances imaginable. But we cannot design our survival around the hope that in every future crisis, someone will make the right choice. We need to reduce our reliance on nuclear weapons. We need better treaties, better verification, better communication. We need to step back from a world where human extinction is always one mistake away. The 3 Soviet submarines that nearly started World War III are a stark reminder of our vulnerability. They show us that the end of the world doesn't necessarily come from malice or evil intent. It can come from confusion, from fear, from people doing what they think is right under impossible circumstances. It can come from a misunderstanding, a malfunction, a moment of panic. And once it starts, it cannot be stopped. There is no undo button for nuclear war. There is no second chance. There is only the decision made in the heat of the moment that determines whether civilization continues or ends. October 27th, 1962. Should be remembered not just as a footnote to the Cuban Missile Crisis, but as the day we nearly died and didn't. Thanks to the courage and restraint of a few men whose names most people have never heard. Vasili Arkhipov, Alexei Dubin, Ryurik Kitov. These men saved the world, and they did it not with grand gestures or heroic speeches, but with simple refusal. The refusal to fire first, the refusal to assume the worst, the refusal to end the world without being absolutely certain it was necessary. In the end, that refusal was enough. Barely. And we should never forget how close it was. If this story has left you thinking about how fragile our world really is, and how many times we've narrowly avoided disaster, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear this story. And subscribe to this channel because there are so many more untold moments in history where everything hung in the balance. Stories that have been classified, forgotten, or deliberately hidden. Stories that reveal just how lucky we are to still be here. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.